so much, Daniel. Our guest today is Dr. Natalie Brito, who is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Psychology at New York University. Dr. Brito earned her doctoral degree in psychology with a concentration in human development and public policy from Georgetown University in 2013. She then spent 2 years as a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar and another 2 years as a postdoctoral research fellow with the Division of Developmental Neuroscience at Columbia University Medical Center. Dr. Brito's research focus is on understanding how early social and cultural contexts shape the trajectory of neurocognitive development, with the goal of better understanding how to best support caregivers and create environments that foster healthy child development. Her talk today is entitled Putting Things in Perspective, Investigating the Role of Early Maternal Experiences on Child Neurocognitive Development. As part of this talk, she is encouraging support for social creatures. So without further ado, here's Dr. Brito.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be able to share some of my work today. So first off, before I begin, the nonprofit that I want to quickly highlight is called Social Creatures. So this organization was actually founded by Rose Perry, who is a developmental cognitive neuroscientist. And she really wanted to translate the work within our field on the importance of social connections through education, advocacy, and innovation. There are a lot of different initiatives within Social Creatures that I really encourage you to check out. But one of the major successes this past year was their Digital Safety Nets campaign, where they raised funds to support internet access and digital solutions for low-income and under-resourced communities that we know are purposely marginalized and who face a lot of social disconnection during the pandemic, whether it be remote learning or telemedicine. And so I really want to thank the coordinators of the seminar series for allowing presenters to have the opportunity to shine light where a child falls on the socioeconomic spectrum may play a role in potentially shaping that child's future outcomes, right? Opportunities is a concern because we know that almost half of children under the age of 3 in the United States live in low-income households, and about a quarter of children in that age range live below the federal poverty line. And of course, most of these children are coming from Black and brown households. So when we measure infants on commonly used tasks within the field, we do see that SES differences emerge pretty early. So in this study, we tested 179 predominantly white infants in measures of language and memory. And just to orient you to the graph, we have time points on the x-axis, so 9, 15, or 21 months. And then we have z-scores of language or memory skills on the y-axis. And so just to give you the gist, we found SES differences in both language and memory skills emerging between 15 and 21 months of age, whereby at 21 months, children of the most highly educated parents scored approximately 3/4 of a standard deviation higher than children whose parents were the least educated. Now, in my research, I also use methods like EEG to examine brain function, which I particularly find to be useful during the infancy years, when sometimes our behavioral measures are limited in their capacity to really examine variability. So although in that behavioral study that I just mentioned, we didn't see SES differences in memory and language skills until the 2nd year of life. There had been a previous study by Tomolsky and Moore that did report SES differences in brain function by 9 months of age. So in this subsequent study, I used a subset of infants from that larger behavioral study I just mentioned. And basically, I just wanted to see, if there are SES differences in neural activity, if, these differences would be present at birth. And so again, just to give you the gist, in this analysis, found no significant associations between SES and EEG activity at birth in any frequency band or any brain region. Now, of course, you can't take the absence of a significant finding as proof that there's no association, right? But at the time, this was actually quite encouraging because this narrative that SES dominates a child's life and is always predictive of negative outcomes is really quite popular within our field. But I do just want to point out that this null finding wasn't just due to a lack of variability in EEG at birth. So although no SES differences in EEG were observed at birth, neonatal EEG power, however, was related to both language and memory outcomes at 15 months of age, which suggests to me that, although the variation in neonatal EEG did contain meaningful signal, this signal was not explained by socioeconomic differences. Now, we have known from studies upon studies within the social sciences that inequality is not healthy, right? And studies examining links between SES and some brain outcome, either structure or function, has really exploded in the last 10 years. But I want to argue that we really need to move away from simply demonstrating links to understanding both mechanism and context if we actually want to produce research that may, eliminate or mitigate some of the negative impacts of these societal inequalities. And so when trying to understand mechanism, there's so many possible factors that contribute to SES differences we see in development. This is a very complex question. And although this is not an exhaustive list, some factors may include access to nutrition, obstacles to adequate prenatal care, environmental toxins, the availability of resources, both within the home and in the community. The list kind of goes on and on. But one area of interest for me is maternal stress. And this is because research consistently demonstrates that the first 2 years of life are sensitive periods during which stable, responsive, warm caregiving, is key to children's social, emotional, and cognitive development. And we also know that, a lack of these relationships does have lifelong implications for health and development. Now, we also know that an infant's neurobehavioral development in the first year is particularly sensitive to the postnatal environment, which includes the mother's mood. So in a longitudinal cohort that I collected during my postdoc with Kim Noble, we tested a cross-sectional sample of infants at 6, 9, and 12 months of age. So close to half of these mothers had less than a college degree. A third of families lived below the poverty line. And so we measured baseline EEG, and the definitions vary by lab. So infants were awake, they were watching an engaging, non-social video for about 5 minutes. And in this study, we took hair samples from the mother to get a measure of cortisol. So we know chronic elevated levels of cortisol have been shown to interfere with learning and also reduce immune function. And CORT can be measured in a variety of ways, right? Saliva, blood, hair, nails, but we chose hair as it is a measure of chronic stress roughly equatable to the last 3 months of life. So again, we wanted to examine associations between, chronic maternal physiological stress and early infant brain activity. So first, I just wanted to see, would we see any EEG differences that were explained by SES? And again, we found no significant associations between any of our SES measures. So we looked at maternal education, family income, as well as family income to needs, which adjusts for the number of people in the household. And again, didn't see any associations between SES and EEG in any frequency band or brain region. We saw a couple tiny trends, but nothing significant after correcting for multiple comparisons. Now, we know that among typically developing children, the relative contribution of low frequency EEG power, like theta oscillations, decrease with age, whereas the relative contribution of higher frequency EEG power, like alpha, beta, and gamma, increase with age. And so within previous findings, children who were raised in environments of adversity, like orphanages or institutional care settings, tend to show an overabundance of low frequency brain power and kind of a relative lack of high frequency power compared to their peers raised in typical care settings. And so within the literature, this pattern has been described as kind of like a maturational lag in neural development. So when we take a look at the results, and I just want to say these analyses were led by a wonderful postdoc in Kim Noble's lab, Sonia Troller-Renfrey. After controlling for SES variables, we find that infants whose mothers had higher levels of cortisol on average had more of this low frequency power compared to infants whose mothers had lower levels of cortisol. That's a bit of a mouthful. So remember, we should be seeing less low frequency EEG power during baseline as infants get older. And then we see the opposite for high frequency bands. So infants with mothers who had higher cortisol concentrations demonstrated reduced high frequency EEG activity during baseline. So we have some preliminary evidence that, infants raised by mothers with this kind of chronic high physiological stress might have some distinct patterns of neural activity. And importantly, these links between maternal stress physiology and child brain function are seen over and above the effects of SES, right? And in this study, we also examined associations between parent-reported levels of perceived stress, and we actually didn't see any associations between maternal perceived stress and infant EEG. And surprisingly, these links between maternal hair cortisol concentrations and EEG continue to hold even after we controlled for maternal levels of perceived stress. Which kind of indicates that our perceptions of stress and stress at the level of physiology may actually not be highly correlated and perhaps might predict very different outcomes. Now, the previous study was cross-sectional, and we didn't start collecting data until about 6 months of age. So in my lab at NYU, my students and I collected data as part of our Stress Home Environment Language and Learning, or SHELL study, where we tested 100 ethnically and linguistically diverse families longitudinally when infants were 3, 9, and 15 months of age. So in this sample, roughly half of the families identified as Hispanic or Latine, and there was a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds, with about 60% of the moms having obtained less than a college degree, and then 40% of the families classified as living in low-income households or making less than the median income in New York City, which is about $58,000 a year. So within SHELL, kind of our overall goal was to examine, several different characteristics of the early home environment and see how they could help to explain or predict various measures of brain function and behavior. And we were particularly interested in early stress associations and potential links to the domains of attention and memory. And so we were interested in attention for a number of reasons, right? So obviously, we know that various forms of attention, emerge early in infancy and underlie most, if not all, cognitive and socio-emotional processes. From the study I had just described, looking at maternal port and infant EEG, as well as other studies, we know that, chronic caregiver physiological stress might impact infant brain function and development. And we also know that the frontal, or specifically the prefrontal cortex, is really adaptively modulated by the HPA axis, which kind of makes it particularly susceptible to the effects of stress. But there actually hadn't been a lot of studies that have investigated these more neural underpinnings of specific cognitive domains like attention within the first 3 months of life. And the specific time point actually might be really important as it marks a sort of transitional point in development of attention where, you know, systems of arousal may be linked with cortical areas like the frontal cortex, which could possibly result in increased efficiency of encoding or information processing. So from the larger sample of 100 families within the Shell study, in this analysis, we have 78 mother-infant dyads. And I just want to highlight that a lot of this work was spearheaded by my amazing graduate student, Annie Aitken. So here we wanted to replicate and extend the previous study, testing links between maternal hair cortisol concentrations and infant brain function, but specifically during periods of attention. But before getting to those results, you know, again, I did want to examine, do we see any associations between SES and EEG power? And again, found no significant differences for maternal education, family income, or family income to needs at 3 months of age. So again, this replicates some of my past work where we really don't see significant associations between SES and infant brain activity in the first year of life. And what is evident is really kind of a great amount of variability across measures. Now, for our measure of attention, we used a paradigm developed by John Richards. He's at the University of South Carolina. So most of the time, attention is measured via looking duration or, you know, the number of shifts in looking. And here we kind of wanted to use a more nuanced measure of attention, whereby we are measuring brain activity only during moments of sustained attention. So I'm going to show you how we did that. So we have a baby watching a very engaging Sesame Street video. At the same time, the baby's wearing ECG electrodes, so we're capturing heart rate, okay? And then from that heart rate signal, we can quantify moments of heart rate deceleration, which reflect periods of sustained attention. Now, what we can do then is overlay our looking time, right, if the infant is looking at the stimuli, onto the ECG signal, and then isolate and use only periods of time where both the infant is looking at the stimuli and ECG denotes attention. And then during these periods of sustained attention, we measure the strength of EEG power. And here we were specifically interested in the theta frequency, as this was measured in previous work. So John's past findings had indicated that there were specific increases in theta power during moments of sustained attention for infants. So what did we find? Even at 3 months of age, we see significant associations between maternal hair cortisol concentrations and reduced EEG theta power during these moments of attention. Again, in previous findings, moments of sustained attention were accompanied by increases in theta power, right? And so now if you split it up between low stress and high stress moms, the finding is a little bit stronger, but I really like showing scatter plots to demonstrate the variability across these two measures. And particularly with infant work, you see a lot of variability. So conceptually, infants raised by mothers with higher levels of chronic stress seem to have kind of distinct patterns of neural activity, you know, even within just periods of attention and as early as 3 months of age. And so what we are currently doing is examining potentially how the stress might be transmitted via social interactions, more specifically biobehavioral synchrony, or the coordinated behavioral and physiological cues between dyads that might support neurobehavioral maturation. So that's what we're doing right now. But what I would like to kind of turn our attention to and focus on next is context. Which brings us to the question of, if there are links between maternal or environmental stress and infant brain development, is there anything that we can do to prevent or mitigate these stressful early experiences for caregivers? And this is where my interest in paid leave comes in. Although most of my work centers around the early caregiving or household context, I am very interested in how larger social structures and policies impact these more proximal interactions, right? So a lot of my work has shown that constraints on parent-child interactions or increased amounts of stress within the home seem to impact early brain and behavior. And so my goal is to really look at all the ways, both, proximal and distal, that we can highlight to reduce maternal stress. And so, we're all psychologists and neuroscientists. We often like to deal with the individual or maybe even just the proximal interactions within the family. But I think it's really important to look at these structural obstacles that women have to overcome, because it's not entirely fair that we ask parents to, attend a parenting intervention to improve caregiver behaviors, or, have the takeaway of a certain study finding be that caregivers should work on stress reduction techniques, when there are clearly systemic inequalities in place that will always dilute the effects of any well-designed intervention. So here in the United States, my plea is that one of the absolute bare minimums afforded to all persons who give birth or adopt a child should be paid family leave. The United States is one of 5 countries in the world, here highlighted in red, as well as the only high-income country that does not have a national policy mandating paid leave to working women who give birth. And in the United States, that amounts to a lot of working caregivers. So recent estimates report around 61% of mothers in married couple families and close to 70% of mothers in single parent households with children under the age of 6 were employed. And so currently our federal policy, which is the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, allows mothers to take up to 12 weeks unpaid leave. And this is categorized as a disability, right? And even with this job protected unpaid leave, caregivers are often unable to take this time off due to financial constraints, right? You have to pay rent, you need to buy food. And return to work too early, with some estimates of 1 in 4 women returning to work within 10 days of giving birth. Additionally, mothers sometimes don't even take the full amount of leave because of our societal norms and stigma of taking this time off. But we know this time off is crucial as mothers are dealing with a host of issues, right? So post-birth complications, lactation difficulties, sheer exhaustion, as well as postpartum depression. And in one large-scale survey, most mothers reported feeling physically better 22 weeks post-birth. And on average, they didn't feel emotionally better until the baby was about 6 months of age. And what's important here is that this stressful experience or environment for the mother is occurring at a time when infants are developing key neural connections in the brain, really driven by early social interactions with their caregivers. So my first question broadly was, are there implications of taking leave, but more importantly, paid versus unpaid leave on infant neurocognitive outcomes? So Karina Kozak, who was a former RA in my lab, and Ashley Greaves, who is my current doc student, led these analysis. So in this study, 446 mothers were surveyed over the phone when their toddlers were between the ages of 24 to 36 months. Now, in addition to, we have demographic and SES variables, mothers were also asked to complete parent report measures of socio-emotional skills using the BITSI and language and cognitive skills using the PARCA-R. Now, the actual main research question in this data collection was not focused on family leave at all, but I was able to include a very short family leave questionnaire. And I specifically asked, if mothers took time off after giving birth, if this time off was compensated monetarily in any way, and then how long they took off before returning to work. Now, if mothers reported any sort of monetary compensation during their leave, they were categorized as having paid leave. So currently, in 2021, there are 8 states and the District of Columbia that offer some level of paid leave or are planning to offer paid leave for mothers. But at the time that we collected this data in 2017, none of the mothers lived in states with state-assisted family leave. Now, within the sample of 446 mothers, we first categorized them into groups based on both maternal employment and leave status. So in pink, we have the not working group. In purple, the stopped working after birth group. And I guess this is turquoise, we have the unpaid leave group, or maybe teal, the unpaid leave group. And then in turquoise is the paid leave group. And it was actually kind of surprising because there were many mothers from lower income households who got paid leave through their work. But it was either in the form of sick days, vacation days, informal agreements with their supervisors, or et cetera. And I just like to show you the distribution because although the paid leave group did have higher SES on average, there was still a lot of variability across all groups for both SES measures. Now, if we simply just look at SES, we unsurprisingly found that higher income was associated with lower BIDSI problem scores, and being high income was also associated with higher general cognitive and linguistic scores as well. Now, first, we wanted to examine the impact of employment post-birth. So, we found that mothers that returned to work at some point after giving birth had infants who had higher linguistic scores during toddlerhood than mothers that did not return to work or had not been working before the baby was born. And this was actually very similar to what had been reported in the literature, that going back to work is associated with increased maternal sensitivity, fewer depressive symptoms for the mother, as well as higher levels of cognitive stimulation within the home. And so we wanted to first look at this to make sure that the takeaway shouldn't just be that mothers should quit their jobs and stay at home with their kids, right? So maternal employment does not prohibit responsive and supportive mother-infant relationships. By nature, employment may decrease the quantity of mother-infant time together, but not necessarily the quality. So for hypotheses related to paid versus unpaid leave, analyses only included mothers who were employed before giving birth and then who returned back to work, right? And all of these analyses controlled for age at testing, gestational age at birth, infant sex, family income, and maternal education. And we found that toddlers whose mothers had paid time off after giving birth had significantly higher language scores than children whose mothers had unpaid time off after giving birth. And this held even after controlling for the length of time off after birth. And here we didn't see any differences in scores assessing general cognitive skills. So here's the finding that I think is really key. When we looked at socio-emotional skills, we found a main effect of paid leave, right? So mothers who had paid leave had infants with better socio-emotional scores. But there was this interaction such that this link between paid leave and socio-emotional scores was only significant for lower SES mothers. So we can think about, who would benefit more from having some financial security during this potentially stressful perinatal period, and maybe not just financial stability, but also the time to devote to their infant when these foundational cognitive skills are being established. So it may be that paid leave is beneficial overall, but very much so to families at the lower end of the SES spectrum. Now, this was the first study to examine links between paid leave and infant developmental outcomes in the United States. But clearly the study is not without its limitations, right? So these are developmental measures, were parent report assessments during toddlerhood. So we were asking very retrospective information about the mother's experiences after birth. So building upon these results, in our shell study, we got a lot more detailed information about mom's postpartum experiences. Both my grad student, Annie, and then my absolutely brilliant postdoc, Denise Werchen, contributed to the next analyses. And just as a reminder, there were 78 infants with usable EEG here, and they had the same demographics as the larger sample. So again, we've kind of categorized our sample into the 4 maternal employment categories again. And as you can see here, just like that first study, although women who received paid leave did have higher SES, there was still quite a lot of variability across groups, especially across the paid and unpaid leave groups. Now, when we examine links between paid leave and EEG power, we wanted to take a look at paid leave as a continuous variable, as we had information on the proportion of financial compensation moms are receiving, right? And this more nuanced information is critical, as not all paid leave experiences are alike. So you have some moms getting their full salary for their period of leave, whereas others were only getting partial pay. So after controlling for a host of covariates, we found many significant associations, but the most robust associations were in the 9 to 13 hertz band, with a higher percentage of paid leave associated with increased EEG power in this higher frequency. Now, in addition to univariate models controlling for multiple comparisons, we also ran some multivariate analyses to examine patterns across different frequencies as well as brain regions. So here we see significant differences between paid and unpaid leave within the lower frequencies. So this is 4 to 6 hertz in the frontal region. We then see significant differences in all 3 brain regions of interest, frontal, parietal, and temporal, within the mid to higher frequencies, but then no differences in what we would consider to be kind of like high frequency gamma. Now, we wanted to take these results and see if we could characterize them in terms of, you know, that EEG maturational pattern that I talked about before, but look at it independent of paid leave status first, right? So Denise ran an exploratory latent profile analysis to look at class membership using individual EEG values as indicators. And this resulted in 2 classes. And the EEG pattern that reflected this maturational profile I talked about earlier of reduced power within the lower frequencies and increased power in the higher frequencies fit the profile of class 2, with infants in this class about 6 times more likely to have mothers who had paid leave than unpaid leave. And then additionally, using a multivariate logistic regression, we put in income to needs, infant age, gestational age at birth, infant sex, and then some indicators of parent-child interaction as predictors of latent class membership. What we did is we found that infant age, paid leave status, and a parent-child interaction measure of behavioral synchrony significantly predicted the probability of class 2 membership. So again, family income was not predictive, and both paid leave status and the quality of parent-child interactions were kind of the most predictive of this maturational pattern of EEG. So overall, paid leave seems to be correlated with both brain and behavioral outcomes, even after accounting for SES. And these preliminary results seem to suggest that paid leave may be acting upon these outcomes via parent-child interaction quality. But of course, more work is really needed here to better understand the causal mechanisms. Now, family leave has been kind of a hot topic this year, with President Biden even promoting it within his address to Congress and his American Families Plan. But I would argue that what is currently discussed is insufficient, because right now who counts as a caregiver is unclear. So historically, domestic partners or extended family members are excluded, right? We base a lot of our policies on this idea of a nuclear two-parent household. And then the employment requirements to obtain paid leave are also really vague. So if the signed legislation closely mirrors current FMLA requirements that right now exclude 44% of eligible workers, then a majority of Americans will still not benefit from this policy. And we know from a wealth of social science research, right, that paid leave is a driver of health and social well-being. So being able to take paid leave has been associated with reductions in infant mortality, increased likelihood of mothers getting their infants to well baby appointments to receive their vaccinations, right? So you don't have to take off time from work to be able to do that. Increased likelihood of breastfeeding if the mother chooses to breastfeed their child, significant reductions in maternal depressive symptoms, both postpartum, but also long-term. And then among fathers who are able to take paternity leave, there are increases in child rearing responsibilities and behaviors. So I'm going to argue that paid leave, therefore, is also a matter of racial justice and equity too. Currently, the majority of Black and Hispanic adults are ineligible or cannot afford to take unpaid leave, right? So simply enacting paid leave using FMLI guidelines are just going to continue to exacerbate racial disparities in health and wealth. Basically, families who have the means and resources already are going to receive an additional benefit. And most likely, women of color are really going to bear the brunt of the inequities, knowing that, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous mothers are much more likely to experience negative pre- and postnatal physical and mental health outcomes, primarily due to lack of quality medical care, as well as experiences of racism. So I just want to end my talk or wrap up my talk by giving a quick preview on an ongoing study we're currently conducting, which are examining the experiences of pregnant and postpartum women during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's really no surprise that the pandemic really exposed the vulnerability of workers and the sheer inability of the majority of Americans to take time off to tend to sick family members or to care for their children. Now, we have some data in a paper led by our postdoc, Cassie Hendricks, that many women experienced a lot of disruptions to their prenatal care, which is what you see graphed here. So the black line denotes the percentage of positive COVID cases and how these disruptions kind of closely mirrored spikes in virus positivity, right? So a significant number of women reported that, they weren't allowed to have a support person, a partner, family member, friend, doula, there for them at the time of delivery. And particularly for first-time moms, having support is so essential for that woman's mental health and well-being. We also heard some disastrous stories from some moms that, they were separated from their baby right after birth because of COVID regulations, or, that mom's COVID test came back positive, so they had to take the baby away. So, imagine having a baby, not being able to hold that baby after delivery, and in some cases not seeing your baby for 24 to 48 hours. There were a lot of incredibly stressful experiences. And we know that, the prenatal and perinatal periods can be associated with significant emotional distress under normal circumstances. And women's mental health is really impacted by their access to social support and resources. So when the pandemic hit, especially in New York City, we knew that this was, of course, a source of stress for everyone, but pregnant and postpartum women may be at a greater risk. So my collaborator, Mariah Thomason, and I felt it was really imperative to evaluate the psychosocial and neurobehavioral consequences of this pandemic on pregnant and postpartum women and their infants. And we specifically wanted to look at profiles of experiences like social isolation, economic vulnerability, healthcare disruption, and kind of these feelings of uncertainty. So we had over 800 women from New York City complete a baseline survey. This occurred between April 2020 and August 2020. Women were either pregnant or had a child under the age of 6 months during this time. 500 of these women signed up to continue within the study, and then they completed like a longitudinal survey series with more in-depth questionnaires occurring every 3 weeks for about 4 months. And we were most recently just awarded 2 NIMH R01s to complete a full neurodevelopmental follow-up with a subsample of families at time points when infants are 6 to 36 months of age. So I'm not going to go too much in depth into the study, but in this, it's complex with a lot of interesting variables. And in this infographic, you just see assessments in that first year. So on the neuroimaging side, we started scanning infants at the neonatal and 12-month time points in the last 4 months. And we're going to start collecting EEG in the next couple of months. But what we have been doing in the past 8 months has been really focusing on remote biospecimen collection and virtual mother-infant observations via Zoom at these 6 and 12-month time points. So within the remote behavioral testing, we're interested in the domains of stress reactivity, emotion regulation, and attention. On the biospecimen side, we are remotely collecting samples of hair, nails, saliva, blood, and breast milk from the moms. We're also collecting infant nails, saliva, and stool samples. And I'm happy to talk about more details in the Q&A. And again, you know, the broader goals of the study are really to evaluate the impact of stress profiles on maternal biology and mental health, as well as examine if, you know, these pathways may lead to differences, if any, right, in child neurodevelopmental outcomes. Now, within our larger COPE study, we do have some variability in terms of SES and race and ethnicity, but it's skewed a bit towards higher SES participants, right? So although we're trying to capture a more representative sample, we're providing Wi-Fi hotspots and tablets to families who don't have reliable internet access. You know, there's inherently going to be a selection bias among families who have the time and willingness to engage in a longitudinal study like this. And so, knowing that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on individuals who identify as Black or Hispanic. So the two kind of graphs that you're seeing here on the left, we see COVID hospitalization and death rates by race and ethnicity. But it's also disproportionate impacts on economic indicators too, right? So the graph on the right, we see that Hispanic families were more likely to lose their jobs or work-related income during the pandemic. And along with Black families, we know we're also more likely to have trouble paying bills, disproportionately disconnected from others because of the lack of technology or internet access. So it was really important to me that we better understand the experiences of families of color. So in my lab, we're also doing a mixed method study to examine the impact of COVID-19 specifically on Hispanic families. And this is led by an extraordinary RA in my lab, Alejandra Lemus. We interviewed 40 Hispanic moms with children under the age of 2. So these were actually conveniently moms that had participated in the Shell study. And then we interviewed 40 new Hispanic moms who were pregnant at the height of the pandemic. And so we wanted to get, you know, a better understanding of the obstacles that these mothers were facing this past year. You know, what issues were most important to them during that time, or, you know, what had the greatest impact on their well-being. And I just want to point out that, you know, although many people are seeing the rollout of vaccines and the reopening of New York restaurants and theaters as a sign that this pandemic is over, you know, even just 2 days ago, the New York Times published an article of the long-lasting impact of the pandemic on the Hispanic community. So this pandemic is clearly not over for a lot of families. And so a qualitative approach was really incredibly important in order for us to identify, you know, what structural limitations were in place that could have constrained mothers' ability to have sufficient support. And what was nice is because of the study design, you know, half of these women experienced COVID after their pregnancy and half during it. So we have this somewhat natural experiment of the impact of COVID stressors on moms. So briefly, just looking at the sample demographics, very diverse in terms of maternal education, over 60% of mothers having less than a college degree. Most of the women were either working full-time or unemployed. And then more than half of the sample had family incomes less than $50,000 a year. Now, within qualitative coding, we're able to report and interpret events within context, right? So a lot of moms shared common experiences about loss of income and job security, you know, not being able to pay their rent or buy necessities for their infants were concerns that caused a lot of anxiety for mothers. What we started picking up on that was really interesting to note is that for a majority of our mothers, concerns about their husband, their children, and even sometimes their extended family members in other countries, right? Because we were looking at the Hispanic community, a lot of these moms were either first or second generation immigrants. You know, their worry about other people took far more precedent than concerns for their own physical or their own mental health. And we are currently also thematically coding for factors that may amplify or buffer their day-to-day stressors, including the presence or absence of experiences of racism and discrimination that may have an impact on COVID-19 illness severity or mental health symptoms. And what we're going to do is we will take these themes, create patterns and profiles of experiences, and then I'm really interested to see if they correlate with specific patterns of infant brain function, right? So we are currently testing families in the lab again. We invited that new cohort of moms who were pregnant at the height of the pandemic into the lab to assess their child's brain activity using EEG. We are taking measures of maternal hair cortisol to measure physiological stress. And then we're also observing mother-child interactions for measures of behavioral and physiological synchrony. And what's really nice is that we have all these outcomes for the other group of families whose mothers experienced their pregnancy pre-pandemic. And so we can kind of make that comparison to look at how the timing of stress prenatally versus postnatally may differ. And we are very much looking forward to kind of blending these qualitative and quantitative measures to really have a more nuanced understanding of how these maternal experiences may impact early infant development. So just to wrap up, maternal stress may be just one mechanism that helps to explain differences in early infant brain function. And in addition to understanding mechanisms, you know, it's really important to also examine these larger societal obstacles that may increase stressful experiences for caregivers. And expanding access to policies that support families in need, like paid leave, may aid in reducing economic and racial inequities faced by families. And then finally, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic really demonstrated, you know, how much of our societal safety net was dependent on caregivers, you know, particularly mothers. And it's really imperative that we identify obstacles to care and sources of stress in order to have a more sophisticated understanding of maternal stress profiles that might impact the developing brain. And this kind of work could potentially also help to identify protective factors that might provide the foundation for future policies and interventions. So with that, I just want to thank my fabulous collaborators, all of our funding sources, and all of my students at the Island Lab at NYU, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for that amazing talk. That was so great. So we're gonna, we have about 5 minutes for questions with our ASL interpreters here, and then we will, in the same meeting, just go straight into the trainee Q&A. So we'll just continue with questions at that point as well. So you are welcome to raise a hand. I'll have my participants tab pulled up and I can call on people, or you can place your questions in the chat. But I'll kick us off Natalie, one of the things that I thought, or Dr. Brito, I'm sorry, that one of the things that I thought was so fantastic about your work was the way you moved from basic science to applying it to these big structural questions around family leave. And so I'm curious what opportunities you see for evaluating structural factors in your future work, that, like the COVID studies that you mentioned. I'm just thinking that during COVID, we did see some pretty enormous structural differences that changed over time in terms of economic impact payments and things like that. So I'm wondering if you have any plans now, hypotheses, or ideas about how you might do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do want to say first off that although my work does kind of weave basic and applied science, I collaborate a lot with social scientists and advocates who do this work on a daily basis, right? It is very, very difficult to just stumble into this field and kind of know what you're talking about. And so it is much, much better to go to the experts first and think meaningful to families, and then kind of compare that to what the implications of your own work are, or the implications of the field. And so I think a lot of my approach is looking at policies, the policies that might impact resources or support for families. And so, you know, a couple of the factors that jump out during COVID was, you know, schools being shut down, childcare being shut down, a lot of caregivers, both fathers and mothers, although I focus mostly on mothers, having the inability to take time off in order to take care of their child and having to juggle both, right? But and we talk a lot about that in terms of kind of America as a whole, but there were also so many caregivers who had to just leave their families and kids at home because they were essential workers, because they had to go sometimes take care of other families' kids. And so I'm really interested in, you know, not just equity, you know, making pay equitable or increasing educational opportunities. You know, what are the resources and policies at the city level, the state level, that could have been implemented in these kind of dire times? And so one clear one was the stipends, or the pandemic checks that were given in. But, you know, from a policy level, they were very, very insufficient. Again, sometimes the help and the resources that are given only are eligible for a small majority or a small minority of families. And so I think how to shift our thinking and frameworks into capturing more families, and not just basing it off of, you know, precedented policies or kind of who counts as like a two-parent household, is things that I think about right now, for sure. Jesse has a question.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay? Is it working? Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you for that talk. So I'm curious how you conceptualize the mother's cortisol hair level. Is it like, do you think of it as like a probe into the stressful environment that the infant may be experiencing? Or is it more of a probe directly of like mom stress, and then a stressed mom interacts with the baby differently? Maybe it's all of those things. I'm just curious to hear more about your thoughts.
No, that's a really, really good question. I think it's all of those things. And right now I'm only looking at a portion of it, right? So of course, if, you know, mom is experiencing elevated stress, there are probably elements within the environment that kind of reflect that. Right now, we are looking at the really proximal interactions between the mom and the baby. And so, you know, are these moms who have this elevated cortisol, are they more or less likely to interact with their child in a certain way, both behaviorally? So we look at things like maternal sensitivity, responsivity, how intrusive they are, you know, but we also look physiologically too. So we have ECG on both the mom and the baby, so we can capture heart rate and look at things like heart rate synchrony and are these patterns disrupted within moms who have higher court than lower court? And I'm also very much interested in our behavioral measures corresponding to our physiological measures too. I think in theory, we think that they should, but oftentimes they don't. And it may be how we're characterizing behavioral incidences of parent-child interaction, right? So if our field, like my field, developmental psychology, has looked at parent-child interactions predominantly in affluent white families, then those types of behaviors and interactions may look very different in a Hispanic family or a Black family. And so I think we really do need to utilize different methods so that we're not always trying to use a biased estimate to make that comparison.